What if Jon Snow grew up with Joffrey? Not as a servant, not as a ward held at careful distance, as a brother. Or what passed for a brother in the Red Keep, which is to say, two boys in the same castle eating at the same table, being told by the same absent father that they were family, and figuring out for themselves what that word actually meant. What if Ned Stark's plan was different? What if, instead of riding north with a secret wrapped around a child, Ned looked at the Red Keep and understood something Robert never did, which is that the safest place to hide a Targaryen was directly inside the house of the man who destroyed the Targaryens. Not in the cold north where distance keeps secrets, in the warm south where noise does. What if Jon Snow grew up as Robert Baratheon's acknowledged bastard? Not a prince, not a secret, just a boy in the Red Keep with Robert's name attached to him and Robert's careless love covering him like armor. No one thought to question. The boy who grew up beside the cruelest prince in the history of Westeros, who watched cruelty being built one small act at a time, who decided, every single day, to be something different. This is not the story of Jon Snow becoming Joffrey. This is the story of what Jon Snow becomes when he watches Joffrey become Joffrey, and chooses otherwise. King's Landing, the Red Keep, 284 AC. Ned makes the decision on the road. He has been carrying the child for 3 days south from the Tower of Joy when he makes it. 3 days of riding with the wet nurse, and the small party, and the baby who has dark hair and grey eyes, and the specific, unimpressed expression of something newly alive that does not yet know what world it has arrived in. He has been thinking about Winterfell. He has been thinking about Catelyn, who is there with their son, who does not know yet what Ned is bringing home, who has agreed to many things in their marriage, but has not agreed to this because she was never asked. He has been thinking about the cover story. A bastard from a southern woman. A woman who died. Jon Snow, bastard of the north. Raised beside Robb in Winterfell. A constant visible reminder to Catelyn of her husband's infidelity. A wound that does not close because it sits at the breakfast table every morning. He has been thinking about what Robert would do if he found out. He has been thinking about the odds of the secret surviving. He and Howland Reed. That is two people who know. Two people, and however long either of them lives, and however many conversations they have, and however many times someone looks at this dark-haired, grey-eyed boy and thinks about Lyanna Stark. The odds are not good. He thinks about the north. He thinks about Winterfell. He thinks about a boy growing up in the cold called a bastard, and not knowing why, and asking questions about his mother, and Ned saying nothing, because Ned has said nothing so many times already, and will say nothing so many more times, and the silence will be the boy's inheritance from him. He thinks about an alternative. He thinks about Robert. Robert, who loved Lyanna. Robert, who has bastards spread across 6 of the 7 kingdoms, with the specific generosity of a man who considers this a form of giving rather than taking. Robert, who would raise a child called his bastard without question, because Robert raises bastards the way other men keep dogs, with fond inattention and the occasional direct warmth. Robert, who is the king. Robert, who is the one man whose name would keep this child safe without requiring secrecy, not because Robert knows the truth, because Robert's name is a wall. Nobody questions the king's bastard. Nobody looks too closely at a boy the king has claimed. The protection is built into the claiming. He turns south. He goes to King's Landing. He goes to Robert. He does not tell Robert the truth. He tells Robert that he found the child in the south. A woman who died. A boy who needs a name. He says, he has the Baratheon look. He says, Robert, look at the boy. Robert looks at the boy. The boy looks back at Robert with grey eyes that are not Baratheon eyes, but are the eyes of a man who has been told what to see and chooses to see it. Robert says, I. He says it with the uncomplicated warmth of a man who is not going to examine the details because the details are not interesting, and the boy is. He says, he has the look. He says, what's his name? Ned says, Jon. Robert says, Jon. He takes the child. He holds him the way Robert holds things he has decided to keep, which is completely, with both hands, with his entire attention. He says, Jon Baratheon. He says, "Welcome to your father's house, boy." He does not look like Ned thinks he will look when he says this. He looks like a man who has been given something he did not know he needed. Ned watches. He thinks, "This is either the most brilliant decision I have ever made, or the most catastrophic." He thinks, it is probably both. He has made his accommodation with both. The Red Keep. 289 AC, 5 years later. Jon is 5 years old when Joffrey first hurt someone in front of him. The someone is a kitchen boy of 8, a slight child named Willem, who has committed the offence of existing in Joffrey's line of sight at a moment when Joffrey is bored. Joffrey is 6, and he has the specific quality of a boy who is already discovering that certain kinds of power over others feel good, and who has no one in his immediate environment who makes the feeling cost anything. The adults look away. Jon does not look away. He is 5 years old, and he is watching Joffrey do something to Willem's arm with a practiced twist that produces a sound from Willem that no sound from a person should be. And Jon thinks, with the instinctive, moral clarity of a very young child who has not yet learned that such clarity is inconvenient, that this is wrong. He does not have words for why it is wrong. He does not need them. He walks into the middle of it. He says, "Stop." He says it the way 5-year-olds say things they mean, which is completely, without the calculation of consequence that adults import into every statement. Joffrey looks at him. Joffrey has been looking at Jon since Jon arrived in the Red Keep as a baby, with the specific wariness of a firstborn child encountering competition in his territory. He does not know Jon is not actually his father's son in the blood sense. He knows Jon has his father's name attached to him and his father's occasional attention, and that these are things Joffrey wants and has not been given in the same quantity. He says, he's a nobody. Jon says, he's a person. He says it with 5-year-old certainty. Joffrey stares at him. He releases Willem's arm, not because he is moved by Jon's intervention, because Cersei has arrived at the far end of the corridor, drawn by the sounds, and Cersei's arrival is the one thing that reliably interrupts Joffrey. Willem runs. Joffrey watches Jon. He says, "You are going to be sorry you did that." Jon says, "All right." Joffrey says, "You don't even care." Jon says, "I care that you hurt him." Joffrey says, "He's nobody." Jon says, "He's Willem." He says it with complete simplicity. As the correction it is, he walks away. He is 5 years old, and he has just made a permanent enemy of the Crown Prince, and he does not know this yet. He knows only that something wrong happened, and he said something, and the something stopped, and the person who was being hurt ran away. He files this. He does it again the next time, and the time after. He keeps filing it. The Red Keep, 292 AC, 8 years old. By the time Jon is 8, he has a reputation, not a famous one. Not the kind of reputation that lords discuss. The kind that lives in the castle's invisible social architecture, in the way servants move when they see him versus when they see Joffrey. In the way the kitchen staff always give him extra, and the grooms always have his horse ready first, and the maids in the corridors always have time to answer his questions. He is Robert Baratheon's bastard, and he is known for one thing. He does not look away. This is the baseline, the thing that everyone who interacts with him eventually identifies. He does not look away from things. Not from the things that are uncomfortable. Not from the things that are someone else's problem. Not from the things that adults have decided are below notice. He looks. He asks. He helps where he can. He has no particular power. He is 8 years old, and he is a bastard in a castle where being a bastard means you are simultaneously more visible than a lord's legitimate son, and entirely without the protections that legitimacy provides. He is not a Baratheon in the legal sense. Robert named him, and Robert's affection covers him like weather, warm when present and frequently absent. He has learned not to rely on Robert's weather. He relies on himself. He also has Tyrion. Tyrion Lannister began talking to Jon when Jon was 4 years old, and Tyrion was visiting the castle and found a dark-haired, grey-eyed child sitting alone in the library looking at a book about horses, with the focused attention of someone who was not looking at horses at all, but using the horse book as cover for watching the adults across the room. Tyrion sat down. He said. "What are you watching?" Jon said. "Lord Baelish." Tyrion said. "What have you concluded?" Jon said. "He has two conversations. The one he is having, and the one he is thinking about." Tyrion looked at this 4-year-old. He said. "Yes," he said. "That is exactly right. He has been coming back to find Jon in libraries ever since. They talk about everything. About the histories and the people in them, and the pattern of how power moves and how people make decisions, and what it means when a decision that looks generous is actually strategic." Jon listens and asks questions, and builds from the answers the way he builds everything. Carefully, with patience, with the interest in accuracy that comes from growing up in a place where accuracy is survival. Tyrion says on one occasion, when Jon is 8 and Tyrion is visiting, "You are going to be extraordinary, or you are going to be very dead." He says it with the honesty of a man who does not soften things he believes. He says, "In this city, those are often the same trajectory." Jon says, "I know." Tyrion says, "Do you?" Jon says, "I watch Joffrey." He says it simply. He says, "I see what he is becoming." He says, "I am choosing to become something else." Tyrion says, "Most children in your position would not have the clarity to choose." Jon says, "I am not most children." Tyrion says no. He says it with the weight of someone making an observation that is both assessment and something warmer than assessment. He says, "You are not. The Red Keep, Joffrey, the years between." Jon watches Joffrey become what Joffrey becomes. This is not a comfortable thing to watch. It is the specific discomfort of watching something that could have gone differently go exactly the wrong way. Jon has thought about this, about whether there was ever a version of Joffrey that was different, and he does not know the answer. He suspects the answer is complicated in the way that the answer to most questions about people is complicated. Some of Joffrey is Cersei's building. Some of it is Robert's absence. Some of it, Jon suspects, is simply what Joffrey is, the specific quality of a person who was going to find cruelty, regardless of who surrounded him. But he watches it happen. He watches Cersei tell Joffrey that the world is arranged in order, and he is at the top of it, and everything below him exists to serve and suffer at his discretion. He watches this happen in small ways. A word here, a lesson there. The specific framing of every experience Joffrey has as proof that he is exceptional, rather than evidence that exceptionality requires effort. He watches Robert tell Joffrey nothing. This is the other side of it. Robert's silence. Robert is not a father who teaches. He is a father who appears occasionally and is loud and warm for the duration of the appearance and disappears again. And what he leaves in his wake is not instruction, but impression. The impression of a large, successful man who conquered a kingdom and drinks and laughs and does not explain himself. Joffrey absorbs the impression. He does not absorb the warmth. He does not have the capacity for it or the proximity to practice it. What he absorbs is the power, the sense that power is its own justification, that the man who takes what he wants is the man who gets to want what he takes. Jon watches all of this. He watches and he thinks about choices. He thinks about the choice to be interested in people rather than powerful over them. He practices this the way he practices sword forms, deliberately, repetitively, building the habit until the habit becomes the nature. He is interested in people. He asks Willem about his family, learns that Willem's mother makes candles in Flea Bottom, visits the candle shop once with the specific deliberateness of someone who believes that knowing where things come from matters. He asks the stable grooms about horses. He learns their names and the horses' names and which horses have which qualities, and he learns because learning itself is interesting, and also because the information about horses is useful later when he rides. He asks the Meisters questions they are not always prepared for. He asks Barristan Selmy, who is the most honourable man he knows in the castle, and who treats Jon with the specific, careful respect of someone who sees something in the boy that he cannot name, about battles. Not the heroic versions, the actual versions, Barristan tells him. He listens. He is building something. He does not yet know its full shape. He knows it is made from the accumulated material of watching Joffrey and choosing differently. He knows it is going to matter. He does not yet know how. The Red Keep, Robert, 291 AC, 7 years old. Robert takes Jon hunting for the first time when Jon is 7. He does not take Joffrey. Joffrey is 8, and does not like the forest, and has inherited his mother's relationship with mud, which is contempt. Robert has tried to take Joffrey hunting, and the results have been the specific catastrophic results of forcing a child who dislikes something into the thing they dislike, and then expressing disappointment about the disliking. He takes Jon. Jon has been asking to go for 2 years. Not demanding, asking. In the patient way, he asks for things, repeating the request at intervals that feel natural rather than pressuring. And Robert has been noticing the asking in the specific way. Robert notices things he wants to give someone, which is by waiting until the moment feels right. The moment feels right in the 3rd week of autumn. They ride out at dawn. Robert and Jon and 6 huntsmen, and the specific smell of the forest in the early morning, which Jon has read about but never experienced, and which is different from the descriptions the way all real things are different from descriptions. He breathes it in. Robert watches. He watches Jon breathe in the forest and make the face that people make when they encounter something they have been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. He says nothing about it. Robert's silences are different from Cersei's silences. Cersei's silences mean something is being calculated. Robert's silences mean something is being felt, and the feeling is taking up the space that words would occupy. They ride for 2 hours. Jon learns to track. One of the huntsmen, an older man named Garth, who has been hunting with Robert for 20 years, teaches Jon to read the signs. The bent grass, the broken branch at the specific height that indicates a deer versus something larger, the direction of the disturbance. Jon asks questions. Garth answers them. Robert watches this and does something Jon does not expect, which is that he does not interrupt. Robert is a man who usually fills spaces he is in with his presence. He is quiet while Garth teaches and Jon learns, watching with the expression of someone watching something they are glad to see without being sure why. At midday, they stop. They eat. Robert says, "You like this?" Jon says, "Yes." Robert says, "More than the city." Jon says, "Everything is more than the city." He says it with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to soften observations for the person they might be about. He says, "In the city, everything is performance." He says, "In the forest, nothing is." Robert looks at him. He says, "You sound like Ned." Jon says, "Lord Stark says similar things." Robert says, "Ned hates the city." He says, "Always has." He says, "Ned belongs in the north, in the cold, where things are what they are." He says, "He has never learned to be comfortable with the south." Jon says, "Is that a flaw?" Robert says, "In a man who lives in the south, yes." He says, "In a man who governs the north, no." He says, "Ned is exactly right for where he is." He says, "The flaw is that I took him out of it." He says this with the specific reflection of a man who occasionally, in the forest, away from the wine and the court, is honest with himself. Jon says, "Why did you?" Robert says, "Because I trust him." He says, "There are not many people I trust." He says, "Ned is one of them." He says, "He is one of them because he has never told me what I wanted to hear." He says, "He tells me the true thing." He says, even when the true thing costs him. Jon looks at Robert. He thinks about this, about what it means that Robert chose Ned precisely for the quality that makes Ned difficult in a court that rewards the opposite. He thinks about the difference between what Robert values and what Robert rewards, and how the distance between those two things is a large part of how the realm ended up where it is. He says, "What do you value?" Robert says, "What?" Jon says, "In a person. What do you actually value?" Robert is quiet for a moment. He says, "Honesty." He says, "And the willingness to do the hard thing when the hard thing is the right thing." He says it with the weight of a man who has not done the hard thing very consistently in his own life. He says, I am better at valuing it in others than in myself. Jon says, that is honest. Robert says, yes. He says, it is. He looks at the forest. He says, you are going to be all right, boy. He says it with the simple warmth of a man who cannot give the name he would like to give and gives the name he has instead. He says, whatever you are. He says, you are going to be all right. Jon says, you too. He says it with the sincere directness of a child who means everything he says. He says, I think you are going to be all right too. Robert says, I haven't been all right in a long time. Jon says, I know. He says, but you could be. He says, it is still available. Robert looks at him. He does not say anything. He reaches out and puts his large hand on Jon's head for a moment. He takes it back. He says, come on. We are going to find something to kill. They ride. Jon learns to track. He loves the forest. He keeps loving it. The Red Keep, Cersei, 293 AC. Cersei has always known Jon is not Robert's son. She knew the moment she looked at the baby Ned Stark placed in Robert's arms. She knew with the complete certainty of a woman who pays attention to the things that other people decide are beneath attention. She looked at the grey eyes and the dark hair, and she thought, whose eyes? She has spent 9 years watching those eyes in the castle. She has not acted on what she knows. This is strategic, not accidental. Cersei is always strategic. The calculation is straightforward. The boy claims no throne. The boy makes no challenges. The boy is Robert's acknowledged bastard, which gives him a name, and no inheritance, and no political standing worth addressing. Moving against him would require revealing that she paid attention to him, which reveals that she found him worth attending to, which raises questions she does not want to raise. She leaves him alone. She does not leave Joffrey alone on the subject of Jon. She allows Joffrey to dislike Jon. She does not instruct him in it. She simply does not instruct him out of it. When Joffrey comes to her and reports that Jon did something insufferable again, some intervention on behalf of some nobody, some act of stubborn, inconvenient decency, she listens and she says carefully, Jon is not like us. She says, he has different blood. She says it with the specific implication of someone who is naming a category difference without explaining its content. Joffrey absorbs this. He absorbs it as confirmation of what he already feels, which is that Jon is wrong somehow, is outside the category of people who matter, is a different species. Jon notices this. He notices it the way he notices everything Cersei does, which is with the complete attention of someone who understands that Cersei is always doing something even when she appears to be doing nothing. He goes to Varys. Jon has been talking to Varys since he was 6. He went to Varys originally because he was looking for information about the castle's cats, and one of the servants told him Varys knew where everything was, including things that moved. Varys found a cat for him. He also found a boy who asks excellent questions and is more interested in accurate answers than in the comfort of the answers he wanted, which is an extremely rare quality in anyone of any age in this castle. They have been talking since. Jon says, why does Cersei call me different blood? Varys says, what makes you think I would know? Jon says, because you know everything that happens in this castle, and you have been watching me specifically since before I understood the watching. Varys says, you notice the watching. Jon says, when I was 6. Varys looks at him. He says, you are 9 years old. Jon says, yes. He says, why does Cersei call me different blood? Varys is quiet for a long time. He says, because she is correct. He says it with the careful delivery of someone who has decided to tell a portion of the truth and is choosing the portion precisely. Jon says, whose blood am I? Varys says, that is not a question I am going to answer today. He says it with the firmness of a man drawing a line for reasons he means. He says, you will know when you need to know. He says, what I will tell you is this. He says, the blood you carry is not a liability. He says, it is a resource. He says, and the person you are becoming is going to determine whether that resource is used correctly. Jon says, what am I becoming? Varys says, something the castle has not produced before. He says, something between what Cersei's son is and what Ned Stark is. He says, the calculation of the one and the conscience of the other. He pauses. He says, that combination in the specific body that will carry it is going to matter very much. Jon says, when? Varys says, when the realm needs it. Jon says, how long do I have? Varys says, years. He says, use them. Jon goes back to his lessons. He uses them. The Red Keep. Tommen. 294 Agi Upsi, 10 years old. Jon becomes Tommen's education. Not formally. Not with the title of tutor or the arrangement of lessons. It happens the way things happen between children in the same castle, organically, through proximity and the specific pull of a younger child toward an older one who does not make the younger child feel small. Tommen is 5 when it begins. He is 5 years old, and he has noticed that Jon does not operate the way most people in the castle operate. He has noticed that Jon talks to servants by name. He has noticed that Jon is the only person in the Red Keep who checks on people who are visibly having a difficult time and does something about it rather than looking away. He has noticed that Jon reads the books about the histories, not for the battles, but for what comes after the battles. He starts following Jon, not obviously, with the specific, careful shadowing of a 5-year-old who knows that announcing the shadowing would end it. Jon notices at the end of the first week. He says without turning around, if you want to come with me, you can just ask. Tommen stops. He says, I didn't know you knew I was there. Jon says, you have been there for 7 days. He says, come on, we are going to the kitchens. Tommen says, why? Jon says, because Cook is having a difficult week and someone should check on her. He says, and because sometimes the kitchens smell better than anything else in this castle, and that is its own sufficient reason. They go to the kitchens. Tommen watches Jon talk to Cook. He watches Jon ask about the specific difficulty she is having, which is that one of her assistants has a sick child at home and is not concentrating, and things have been burning. He watches Jon listen and nod, and then ask if the assistant's family needs anything, and whether there is something the household steward could arrange. He watches Cook's face during this conversation. He has seen faces during conversations with Joffrey and faces during conversations with his mother, and faces during conversations with his father. He has seen the careful managed presentations of people who are performing for power. He has never seen a face do what Cook's does now, which is relax completely, the specific release of someone who has been holding a great deal and is being given, momentarily, permission to set it down. Tommen says afterward, she looked different. Jon says, how? Tommen says, like she remembered she was a person. Jon stops. He looks at Tommen. He says, yes. He says it with genuine surprise, and something that is not quite pride but is adjacent to it. He says, that is exactly what happened. He says, you saw it. Tommen says, why doesn't everyone do that? Jon says, because it requires paying attention to people. He says, most people pay attention to things that are useful to them. He says, Cook is not obviously useful to the lords of this castle. He says, she is entirely useful to everyone who eats. Tommen says, that is everyone. Jon says, that is everyone. He says it with the satisfaction of someone who appreciates when logic lands cleanly. He says, there is a lesson in there. Tommen says, what lesson? Jon says, that the people who are the foundation of how things work are often the most invisible to the people who benefit from the foundation. He says, a lord who understands where his bread comes from is a better lord than one who doesn't. Tommen thinks about this. He says, father doesn't know where his bread comes from. Jon says, no. He says it without cruelty. He says, he doesn't. Tommen says, Joffrey doesn't. Jon says, no. Tommen says, do you think I can learn? Jon says, I think you are already learning. He says, you saw Cook's face. He says, most people wouldn't have. Tommen looks at him. He says, will you keep showing me things? Jon says, yes. He says, it is what I do anyway. He says, you might as well be there. They walk back through the castle. Tommen walks beside Jon with the specific quality of a child who has decided to model himself on something and has found the something. This is how it begins. Over the next 4 years, Tommen learns from Jon the things that no one else in the Red Keep is teaching him. He learns to ask questions. He learns to look at the people who are doing the work underneath the performance of power. He learns that understanding where things come from is more useful than assuming they arrive. He learns that cruelty is fear, and that fear can be addressed, or it can be fed. And the choice between those two options is the choice that defines a person. He does not become Jon. He becomes Tommen. But Tommen, shaped by these years, is something the castle did not produce before him. A gentle boy who grows into a gentle man, who knows that gentleness is not weakness, who knows this because Jon told him and then proved it every day. The Red Keep, 296 AC, 12 years old. Joffrey is 12 when the cat incident happens. The cat belongs to a serving girl named Alla. It is an orange cat, elderly, with one ear, and it has lived in the kitchens for 11 years and is universally liked in the specific way that castle animals are liked, with the warm familiarity of something that has been there long enough to be part of the place. Joffrey kills it. He does not kill it in anger. He does not kill it because it did something. He kills it with the specific deliberateness of someone who has decided that a thing existing is sufficient reason to end it, that power over life and death is its own satisfaction. He makes Tommen watch. Tommen is 7. He does not handle this well. Jon finds out 2 hours later. He finds out because the serving girl Alla is in the corridor outside the kitchens, and she is crying with the particular quality of someone who is trying very hard not to cry, and has lost the try. He stops. He says, "What happened?" She tells him. He listens. He thinks for a moment about what Joffrey is. Not what Joffrey has done. What he is. He has been watching Joffrey become himself for 7 years, and he has always understood that the becoming was moving in a direction that ended in something terrible. He did not know when the end would arrive. He knows now. He finds Tommen. Tommen is in his chambers, small and pale and 7 years old, and having learned something today about what his brother is that no 7-year-old should have to learn. Jon sits with him. He does not say anything immediately. He sits with Tommen in the specific way of someone who understands that presence matters before words, and that words before presence are just noise. After a while, Tommen says, "It was my fault." Jon says, "No." Tommen says, "I couldn't stop him." Jon says, "You are 7 years old." He says, "It was not your job to stop him." He says, "It was not your fault." Tommen says, "He looked at me. When he did it, he was looking at me." Jon says, "I know." Tommen says, "He wanted me to watch." Jon says, "I know." Tommen says, "Why?" Jon sits with this question. He has been sitting with the why of Joffrey for 7 years, and he has arrived at an answer that he believes is accurate, and that he is going to give to a 7-year-old as carefully as it can be given. He says, because he is afraid. Tommen says, "Afraid of what?" Jon says, "Of being small." He says, "Everyone is afraid of being small." He says, "Most people deal with the fear by making themselves bigger through things they make, through work and kindness and the connections they build." He says, "Joffrey deals with the fear by making other things smaller." He says, "It looks like power." He says, "It is not power." He says, "It is the thing power does when it is not real." Tommen is quiet. He says, "Does that mean Joffrey is not powerful?" Jon says, "Joffrey is going to be king someday." He says, "He will have enormous power." He says, "But real power is not about making things smaller." He says, "He will have the kind of power that looks like power." He says, "That is not the same thing." Tommen says, "What is real power?" Jon says, "The ability to make things better." He says it simply. He says, "That is the only kind of power worth having." Tommen looks at him with the wet eyes of a 7-year-old who has had a terrible day. He says, "Jon." Jon says, "Yes." He says, "I am glad you're here." Jon puts his hand on Tommen's shoulder. He says, "I'm glad too." He is. He is glad he is here in this specific castle with this specific boy who is going to grow up beside Joffrey and who desperately needs someone who will tell him the truth about what he is watching. He thinks, this is what I am for. Part of it. He thinks about Varys's words, the calculation of the one and the conscience of the other. He thinks, I am the conscience. He thinks, that is enough for now. The Red Keep. Barristan Selmy, 297 AC. Barristan finds Jon in the yard at an hour when the yard is empty. Jon has been training here alone in the early mornings since he was 9. The Master-at-Arms trains him in the official sessions, but the official sessions are training. The mornings are something else. The mornings are Jon working through the specific problem of who he is when he fights, which is different from how he is trained to fight, and finding the version that is his. Barristan watches from the entrance. He watches for 20 minutes without Jon noticing. Then Jon notices. He stops. He says, Sir Barristan. Barristan says, continue. He says it with the authority of a man who has watched many people fight and has opinions. Jon continues. When he finishes the form, Barristan says, you have been studying the Braavosi style. Jon says, from a book. Barristan says, which book? Jon names it. Barristan says, that book is incomplete. He pauses. Pick up the sword. Jon picks up the sword. Barristan teaches him for an hour. He teaches him the way he teaches things he considers worth teaching, which is without economy. Everything that is relevant, given regardless of whether it was asked for. He shows Jon the specific corrections that the book got wrong. He shows him the adaptation that makes the Braavosi style workable for someone of Jon's build, which is northern, which is heavier in the shoulders than the Braavosi tradition assumes. Jon absorbs everything. This is the quality that Barristan has been watching in him for years. The complete absorption. Whatever Jon is taught, he keeps and builds from. He does not circle back to the same mistakes. He files the correction, and the correction becomes the new baseline. When they finish, Barristan says, sit. Jon sits. Barristan sits. He says, I have been watching you for some time. Jon says, I know. Barristan says, what do you know? Jon says, that you are the most honorable man in this castle, and you have been trying to determine whether I am worth investing in. He says it directly, not as flattery, as the observation he has made. He says, I believe you have decided I am. Barristan says, why do you believe that? Jon says, because you are teaching me. Barristan says, yes. He looks at Jon with the specific attention of a man who has served kings for 40 years and has developed the specific expertise of knowing which quality of person is which by looking at them carefully. He says, in this castle there are 2 kinds of people. He says, people who use their position to take from others, and people who use their position to protect. He says, in my experience, this division is visible very early in life and almost never changes. Jon says, which am I? Barristan says, you have been protecting things since you were 5 years old. He says it with the flat certainty of someone stating documented fact. He says, the kitchen boy, the various servants, Tommen, who you are raising as carefully as any parent I have observed. He says, you are a protector. Jon says, is that useful? Barristan says, it is what the Kingsguard is supposed to be. He says, what it rarely is in practice. He says, a man who protects things because it is right rather than because it is required. He says, that quality, in my experience, produces the kind of person who can do what needs to be done when the situations that require it arrive. Jon says, what situations? Barristan says, the ones where protection costs you something. He says, the ones where the right choice is also the hard one. He says, I have been in those situations. He says, the men who held in those moments were the men who had been making the small choices consistently for years. He says, the character is built before the crisis arrives. Jon says, you are telling me to keep making the small choices. Barristan says, I am telling you that the small choices are the only choices that matter. He says, everything else is consequence. He stands. He says, same time tomorrow. Jon says, same time tomorrow. Barristan leaves. Jon sits in the yard. He thinks about small choices. He thinks about Willem's arm and Alla's cat and Tommen's wet eyes and all the small moments he has stepped into because stepping in was right. He thinks the small choices are the only choices that matter. He picks up the sword. He practices. The Red Keep. 298 AC. Ned arrives. Ned Stark arrives in King's Landing with Robert's appointment as hand. He arrives and Jon is in the courtyard. They have seen each other twice in 14 years. Brief visits. Managed. Ned looking at Jon with the complicated regard of a man who is performing an uncle's occasional duty while carrying something that cannot be said. Jon looking at Ned with the specific attention he gives everyone, and the particular additional weight of a boy who has always sensed the something that cannot be said. They look at each other in the courtyard. Ned has aged. Not badly, but visibly. The grey that was only at his temples the last time Jon saw him has moved through most of his hair. The lines in his face are deeper. He carries the north in his body, the specific quality of a man who has been managing an enormous cold thing for 20 years. Jon is 14. He has been in this castle for 14 years. He has the grey eyes and the dark hair and the face that is working out what it is going to be permanently. That adolescent, not quite arrived quality that contains both what was and what is coming. Ned says, "You look well." Jon says, "Lord Stark." Ned says, "Ned." He says it with the particular quality he always gives that word in Jon's presence, the quality of a man who cannot say the word he means and says the adjacent one. Jon says, "Ned." They walk. They walk in the way they have always walked when they are together, which is without particular destination, processing the being together through movement, because the being together is complicated in ways that sitting still amplifies. Ned says, "How are you actually?" Jon says, "Honestly." Ned says, "Honestly." Jon says, "Tired." He says it with the honest exhaustion of someone who has been making small choices against the current of a place that rewards large choices in the wrong direction. He says, "This is not a restful castle." Ned says, "No." He says it with feeling. He says, "I know." Jon says, "Joffrey is going to be a problem." Ned says, "Yes." Jon says, "A specific kind of problem." He says, "Not the ordinary kind." He says, "The kind where the problem has a crown attached to it, and armies behind it, and people who will do what it says because of the crown." Ned says, "I know." Jon says, "Robert doesn't see it." Ned says, "Robert sees what he wants to see about his children." Jon says, "I know." He says, "I have been watching it for 14 years. He says, "Robert looks at Joffrey and sees what he wants to see, and looks away, because looking at what is actually there requires acknowledging that something went wrong." He says, he does not want to acknowledge that something went wrong. Ned says, "Jon." Jon says, "Yes." Ned says, "How much have you been watching?" Jon says, "Everything." He says it with the flat completeness of someone who means it entirely. He says, "I have spent 14 years in this castle learning how it works." He says, "I know where the power actually lives versus where it appears to live." He says, "I know which members of the small council are Cersei's and which are their own and which are something else." He says, "I know what Littlefinger is doing with the treasury, and I know Varys knows I know. And I know Varys is watching me, determine what to do with knowing it." Ned looks at him. He says, "You have been running your own intelligence." Jon says, "I have been paying attention." He says it with the correction of someone who is precise about terminology. He says, "Paying attention in this castle produces intelligence the same way breathing produces air." He says, "You don't choose to collect it." He says, "You just breathe." Ned is quiet. He says, "There are things you need to know." Jon says, "There are things I already know." He says, "There are also things I suspect, but cannot confirm without someone who has the missing pieces." He pauses. He says, "Ned." He uses the name with the specific deliberateness of someone who has been waiting for the right moment. He says, "Am I Robert's son?" The corridor is very quiet. Ned says nothing for a long moment. Jon says, "I have been looking at this from multiple angles for 3 years." He says, "The hair records, the Baratheon lineage." He says, "The way you look at me." He says, The way Varys watches me. He says, the way Cersei called me different blood when she thought I was not listening. He says, I have been assembling the picture for 3 years. He says, I have a picture. He says, I'm asking you to complete it. Ned says, Jon. Jon says, please. He says it quietly. He says it with 14 years in it. Ned looks at his nephew. He makes the decision. He says, come with me. The Red Keep. The truth. 298 AC. They find a room. Not Ned's solar. Not Jon's chambers. A room that belongs to neither of them. A small withdrawing room off the eastern corridor that is rarely used, and that Jon knows is rarely used because he knows which rooms are rarely used. And this is the kind of knowledge that becomes useful in moments exactly like this one. Ned closes the door. He sits. Jon sits. Ned tells him. He tells it with the economy of a man who has been holding something for 14 years, and whose instinct is toward directness now that the moment has finally come. He tells him about Lyanna, about the Tower of Joy, about the 3 Kingsguard who died to protect the secret, and the 2 men who survived to carry it. He tells him about the promise. He tells him what she said and what she asked, and how she looked, and what it sounded like when she was gone. He tells him who his father was. Jon listens. He listens with the specific quality he has been developing since he was 5 years old. The complete, focused reception of information that he processes as it arrives, organizing it against what he already knows, finding where the pieces fit. They fit everywhere. Everything fits. Every gap in his understanding of himself snaps closed with an audible quality that is not a sound but feels like one. Every question he has been asking sideways since he was old enough to ask questions finds its answer. He is the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. He has been living in the Red Keep for 14 years. He has been Robert's bastard for 14 years. The king who killed his father. The king whose grief for his mother is the foundational fact of the current dynasty. The man who looked at a dark-haired, grey-eyed baby and saw what he wanted to see. And Jon has been using that wanting to see as cover for 14 years. He sits with all of this. He sits for a long time. Ned waits. Jon says finally, she left me here, in a sense. He says it with the quality of someone understanding something for the first time from the inside. He says, she left me here, because here is where I would be invisible. He says, in plain sight, in Robert's house, covered by Robert's name. Ned says, I did not know if it was the right choice. He says, I made the best one I could. Jon says, it was the right choice. He says it with conviction. He says, Ned, I have spent 14 years learning this castle. He says, I know it better than anyone who lives in it. Better than the people who have lived here for 30 years, because they stopped looking when they got comfortable, and I have never stopped looking. He says, what I know about this city and this court and the specific people in it. He says, that is not an accident. He says, that is what growing up here produces, if you are paying attention. Ned says, Jon. Jon says, I am not angry. He says it before Ned can say whatever he was going to say, addressing the fear underneath the waiting directly. He says, I am not angry that you kept it. He says, I understand why. He says, I understand what Robert would have done. He says, I am the last person to judge someone for keeping a secret in this city. He says, I have been keeping several. Ned says, what secrets? Jon says, Littlefinger's accounting, the specific mechanism of how he has been embezzling from the crown. I have had this for a year. He says, the Queen's children. He says it flatly. He says, I identified the parentage question 3 years ago and confirmed it 2 years ago through the birth records and hair lineage. He says, I have been deciding what to do with it. Ned stares at him. Jon says, and now I know what to do with it. He says, because now I know the full picture. He says, and the full picture tells me where everything needs to go. Ned says, what is the full picture? Jon says, the Queen's children are not Robert's. He says, Robert is going to die soon. He says, the boar hunt is being arranged. He says, not specifically by Cersei. He says, the timing is Cersei's preference, but the arrangement is Littlefinger's, and the mechanism is Pycelle's. He says, the wine has been being modified for months. He says it with the flat delivery of documented facts. Ned is very still. He says, you know about the wine. Jon says, I know about Pycelle. I know about the specific substance. I know it does not kill on its own, but reduces the reflexes and the judgment in ways that make other accidents more likely. He says, I have known for 3 months. He says, I have been deciding what to do with knowing it. Ned says, and what have you decided? Jon says, that stopping the boar hunt is one option and not the right one. He says, stopping it just delays the crisis and gives Cersei time to find a different mechanism. He says, the right option is to be ready for what comes after. He says, to have the pieces in position when the moment arrives. He says, to be able to move cleanly when the board opens. He says, I have been doing that. He says, I needed the last piece, which was who I am. He says, now I have it. Ned looks at his nephew. He looks at the 14-year-old boy who has been running intelligence in King's Landing for 3 years and who has just received the largest piece of information about himself that exists and who is filing it and building from it with the specific composure of someone who was never going to stop. He says, what do you need from me? Jon says, stand with me. He says, when the moment comes. He says, I will tell you when. Ned says, all right, Jon says. And Ned, he says it with the quality of someone completing a circuit, closing something that has been open. He says, thank you. He says, for bringing me here. He says, for making this choice instead of another one. He says, I know what it cost you. Ned says, it cost less than you think. Jon says, it cost you your reputation. It cost Catelyn 14 years of a wound. Ned says, it kept you alive. He says, the accounting is acceptable. Jon looks at him. He says, she would have agreed with you. Ned says, yes. He says it with the weight of knowing. He says, she would have. The Red Keep. Varys. The full truth. 298 AC. Varys comes to him 3 days after Ned tells him. He comes in the way Varys comes, which is without announcement, the door opening at a moment when Jon is alone, and Varys is simply present on the other side of it. Jon says, you already know. Varys says, I have known for 11 years. He says it with the specific quality of finally saying something that has been true for a very long time. He says, the specific combination of your mother's eyes and your father's bone structure, and the manner in which you were introduced to this castle, and the manner in which certain records were quietly adjusted. He says, I have known. Jon says, why did you say nothing? Varys says, because the information without a plan is a liability. He says, you were not ready to be part of the plan. He says, now you are. Jon says, what is the plan? Varys says, I have several versions of a plan. He says, the specific version depends on which variables hold. He says, your involvement changes the variables considerably. Jon says, in what direction? Varys says, toward the better outcome. He says it with the flat assessment of someone who has been running the calculation for a decade and is updating it now. He says, I have been watching you since you were old enough to watch. He says, I have been watching what you were becoming. He says, what you have become is something I did not expect when I first began the watching. Jon says, what did you expect? Varys says, I expected the Targaryen blood to produce the Targaryen qualities, the beauty and the fire, and the specific consuming intensity that the line is known for. He says, what I did not expect was the addition of 14 years of watching Joffrey. He says, the watching did something I could not have predicted. Jon says, what? Varys says, it produced someone who understands power completely and is specifically immune to the desire for it. He says it with the quiet precision of someone making a careful observation. He says, the Targaryen line produced many great rulers and many terrible ones. He says, The difference between the great and the terrible was usually whether they wanted the throne for what they could build with it or for the feeling of having it. He says, you have grown up watching what wanting the feeling does to a person. He says, I do not believe you want the feeling. Jon says, I don't. Varys says, what do you want? Jon says, the realm to work. He says it simply. He says, people to be safe. He says, the things coming from beyond the wall to be addressed before they cannot be addressed. He says, the right people in the right positions managing it all. He says, that is what I want. He says, the throne is a chair. He says, it is only useful if the person sitting in it wants those things. Varys says, and do you think the person sitting in it should be you? Jon says, I think the question of who sits in it is secondary to what they do once they're sitting. He says, right now the relevant question is Stannis. He says, Stannis is the lawful heir. He says, I am something else. He says, I do not want to be something else in a way that creates a crisis. He says, I want to be useful. Varys looks at him. He says, you are 14 years old. Jon says, you are going to have to stop saying that. Varys says, why? Jon says, because I know how old I am, and the knowing does not change what I know. He says, age is relevant, and it is not the relevant thing here. He says, what is relevant is what I have learned and what I can do with it. He says, those things do not become more relevant when I turn 15. Varys is quiet. He says, all right. He says it with the quality of conceding a fair point. He says, what do you need from me? Jon says, everything you have on the accounting. He says, everything you have on Pycelle and the wine. He says, and your specific read on Littlefinger's positioning after the transition. He says, I have my read. He says, I want yours. Varys says, my read on Littlefinger. Jon says, he is positioning himself to be indispensable to Cersei's regency. He says, the embezzlement continues under the chaos of the transition. He says, he has made specific arrangements with the Keeper of Coin in anticipation of Robert's death. He says, the arrangements are designed to look like emergency governance measures. He says, they are not. Varys says, your read is correct. He says it without surprise. He says, when did you put this together? Jon says, 14 months ago. He says, I have been waiting for the right moment to act on it. Varys says, and now? Jon says, now Ned is hand. He says, now the pieces are in position. He says, now the moment has arrived. Varys sits across from him. He looks at this 14-year-old who has been living in his castle and in his sightlines for 14 years. He says, I owe your mother something. He says it without explanation, but with the weight of a man who has been carrying an obligation for a very long time. He says, I was not in a position to help when she needed help. He says, I have been in a position to protect what she left, and I have done that. He says, I want you to know that I have done that. Jon says, I know. He says it simply. He says, Varys. He says, thank you. Varys says, don't thank me. He says, win. Jon says, that is what I intend. The Red Keep. The small moves. 298 AC. He begins moving pieces. Not dramatically. Not in ways that announce themselves. The way Jon has always done things, which is quietly and with the patience of someone who understands that the game is won before the critical move is made. And the critical move is only the confirmation. He goes to Tyrion. He finds Tyrion in the library, which is where Tyrion usually is when he is in the castle and not drinking. And the two of them are often in this library together. And Tyrion looks up when Jon enters with the expression of a man who can tell something has changed. He says, you know. Jon says, yes. Tyrion says, everything? Jon says, most of it. He says, you knew. Tyrion says, I suspected. He says, the specific combination of features and the specific manner in which you were introduced to the castle and the specific way Varys has been watching you. He says, I suspected from the beginning. He says, I did not know for certain. Jon says, "Are you going to be a problem?" Tyrion says, "No." He says it without hesitation. He says, "I am going to be an asset." He says, "Which is what I have always been." He says, "The question is which direction?" Jon says, "The same direction as always." He says, "The direction of the realm not tearing itself apart." He says, "The direction of the right people holding things together." Tyrion says, "And you consider yourself the right people." Jon says, "I consider myself part of them." He says, "You, Ned Barristan." He says, "Varys in his way." He says, "People who understand what the realm actually is and who are capable of the specific combination of knowing the game and not losing themselves in it." Tyrion says, "The knowing the game part is Lannister." Jon says, "Yes." He says it without apology. He says, "Growing up in this castle with you as a teacher will do that." Tyrion almost smiles. He says, "What do you need?" Jon says, "The accounting. Littlefinger's specific mechanism. I have my version. I need yours." Tyrion says, "You have been looking at the treasury accounts." Jon says, "For 2 years." Tyrion says, "They are restricted access." Jon says, "Yes." He says, "Which is why it took me 2 years instead of 2 months." Tyrion says nothing for a moment. He says, "You know the number." Jon says, "Approximately." Tyrion says, "The specific account." Jon says, "Yes." Tyrion says, "And you want my version to confirm yours?" Jon says, "Yes." Tyrion opens a drawer. He produces a document. He hands it to Jon. He says, "I've had this for 8 months." He says, "I have been trying to determine the right moment to use it." He says, "I believe you are telling me the right moment has arrived." Jon reads. He looks up. He says, "You had everything." Tyrion says, "I had everything." He says, "I was missing the specific context for why it mattered right now." He says, "Which you now have." Jon says, "Littlefinger is positioning himself for the transition." He says, "When Robert dies, Joffrey takes the throne." He says, "Littlefinger's arrangement with Cersei gives him the position to continue the embezzlement under the new reign's confusion." He says, "He has been building to this for years." Tyrion says, "Yes." Jon says, "We cut him off before Robert dies." He says, "We expose the mechanism to the right person who can act on it." He says, "Not Robert." He says, "Ned." Tyrion says, "Ned Stark as hand." Jon says, "Ned Stark as hand with this accounting and the specific authority to act on it." He says, "Littlefinger neutralized." He says, "The treasury honest." He says, "The transition managed rather than chaotic." Tyrion looks at him. He says, "And then what?" Jon says, "And then we deal with the succession." He says, "Stannis Baratheon is the rightful heir." He says, "The documentation of Joffrey's parentage goes to Ned." He says, "Ned manages the revelation." He says, "Cleanly." He says, "Without the city tearing apart." Tyrion says, "That is very ambitious." Jon says, "Yes." Tyrion says, "You are 14 years old." Jon says, "You have said that to me before." He says, "It was less relevant every time." Tyrion almost laughs. He says, "All right." He says it with the specific quality of someone committing to a direction they have been moving toward for a while without naming it. He says, "What specifically do you need me to do?" Jon tells him, "The Red Keep." Joffrey, the night before. Joffrey finds Jon the night before the hunt. He finds him in the corridors outside the Great Hall, and the finding is not accidental, because Joffrey's findings are never accidental. He has Meryn Trant with him, which is the specific armor of a boy who has learned that his own presence is not always sufficient. He looks at Jon. Jon looks at him. They are the same age. They are nothing alike. Joffrey says, "You've been busy." He says it with the tone of someone who's been watching activity in the castle and has noticed the pattern if not the content. He says, "You and the imp, you and the old knight, you and Lord Stark." Jon says, "Yes." Joffrey says, "Planning something." Jon says, "Talking." He says it simply. He says, "I like to talk to interesting people." He says, "I always have." Joffrey says, "You have always been looking at me." He says it with the quality of something that has been sitting in him for a while. He says, "Since we were children." He says, "You look at me like you are studying me." Jon says, "Yes." Joffrey says, "Why?" Jon looks at the prince he has grown up beside, the boy he has been watching become himself for 14 years, the person who has been his study and his warning and his constant reminder of what he is choosing not to be. He says, "Because you are a lesson." Joffrey says, "A lesson." Jon says, "What happens when someone grows up being told they are exceptional instead of learning what exceptional requires?" He says it without cruelty, with the specific, flat honesty of someone who has made peace with what he sees. He says, "What the unchecked entitlement of rank produces." He says, "I have watched it happen in real time." He says, "You have been my education in what I am trying not to become." Joffrey stares at him. He says, "You are nobody." He says it with the specific violence that people deploy when they are trying to wound. He says, "You are a bastard with a borrowed name, and you have spent 14 years following me around and pretending you understand something." Jon says, "I have spent 14 years learning something." He says, "There is a difference." He says, "What I have learned is this." He says, "Power over people feels like power. It is not power." He says, "Power for people." He says, "The kind that builds things, the kind that protects things." He says, "That is what power is." He says, "You have never had it." Joffrey's face. He says, "Tomorrow after the hunt, I am going to..." Jon says, "Tomorrow after the hunt, everything changes." He says it with the quiet of someone who knows this and is not making a threat. He says, "Whatever you are planning to do after the hunt, the situation will not allow it." He says, "I am sorry about that in a specific way that has nothing to do with what you were going to say." He says, "I am sorry because you did not have to become what you are." Joffrey says, "What am I?" Jon says, "Afraid." He says it the same way he told Tommen, with the same compassion, with the same accuracy. He says, "You have always been afraid." He says, "Of being small." He says, "Of being ordinary." He says, "Of needing people and not having them." He says, "The cruelty is fear wearing a different face." He says, "You did not choose the fear." He says, "You chose how you responded to it." Joffrey says nothing. He stares at Jon with eyes that are doing something complicated. Jon says, "Get some sleep." He says, "Tomorrow is a long day." He walks away. Behind him, Meryn Trant says something to Joffrey that Jon does not hear. He does not need to. He has said what he needed to say. Not for Joffrey. For himself. 14 years of watching. One honest conversation. That is all it was ever going to be. King's Landing. After 298 AC. The hunt happens. Robert is wounded. He dies 3 days later. Slower than the boar wound strictly requires. Faster than he might have died without the wine that Pycelle stopped providing once Jon placed Ned's specific eyes on Pycelle's specific activities. Jon is with Robert at the end. He sits at the king's bedside the last night. Not because he is required to, because Robert is dying, and Robert has been his father in the only way available. And the grief about the truth of what that means is its own complicated thing that Jon has been sitting with for 14 days since Ned told him. Robert looks at him. He says, "You have her eyes." He says it the way he has said it every few years, when the wine is less, and Robert is present in the way he is rarely present. He says, "Lyanna's eyes." He says, "Every time I look at you." He says, "I thought it was because I wanted to see her somewhere." Jon says, "Robert." Robert says, "Are you hers?" Jon says nothing for a moment. He says, "I am yours." He says it with the specific truth of 14 years of a man's name covering a child and what that covering produces, which is a kind of belonging that the blood alone cannot give. He says, "You gave me your name." He says, "You gave me this castle." He says, "Whatever else is true." He says, "You gave me the chance to become what I am." He says, "That is what I am." Robert looks at him. He says, "Whatever it takes." He says it with the echo of a man who has said these words before, to another person, in another room. He says, "Promise me." Jon says, "I promise." Robert dies at dawn. Jon sits with him until he does. Then he stands. He goes to Ned. He says, "Now." What if Jon Snow grew up with Joffrey? He watched cruelty being assembled piece by piece. He chose every day something different. Not because he was told to. Not because someone taught him the lesson. Because he was paying attention, and the paying attention showed him exactly what cruelty costs the person it belongs to. He grew up beside the worst prince in Westerosi history. He became something the Red Keep had never produced. Not a schemer. Not a warrior. Not a king. Someone who looked at a dying man in a bed and said, "You gave me your name and the chance to become what I am." Someone who said to a future king, "The cruelty is fear wearing a different face." Someone who spent 14 years in the most poisonous court in the world and came out of it knowing exactly what poison does and choosing never to be it. That is what growing up with Joffrey made Jon Snow. The anti-Joffrey. The thing the throne always needed. The thing it almost never gets. A person who knows the game and refuses to play it the way the game wants to be played. Who plays it towards something worth playing toward. Ready. King's Landing. What comes after? 298 AC. What comes after is not clean. Nothing in King's Landing is clean. Jon has known this since he was old enough to understand that the city is built on the specific sediment of every previous crisis that was managed and not resolved, every conflict that was deflected rather than addressed, every truth that was suppressed because the truth was inconvenient and convenience was the primary currency. He has planned for not clean. The days after Robert's death are exactly as complicated as he anticipated, and he works through them with the patience of someone who has been building toward this for years and can absorb the complications without losing the shape of where he is going. Ned and the small council, the documentation, the succession question going to Stannis. These go as planned because Ned Stark does what Ned Stark does, which is the right thing, cleanly and directly and at cost to himself. And Ned has the specific additional clarity now of having talked to Jon and understood the full picture and having a plan rather than operating on virtue alone. Virtue alone, Jon has always felt, is a weapon that needs a sheath. The sheath is strategy. Ned has both now. Cersei is the variable. Jon goes to Cersei, not to negotiate, not to threaten. He goes because she is Joffrey's mother and Tommen's mother and Myrcella's mother, and because Jon has spent 14 years watching her, and he believes, underneath everything she is, that her children are the real thing, the one genuine thing she has not performed. He finds her in her solar. She looks at him. He sits without being invited. He says, "I am not your enemy." She says, "You are threatening my children's succession." He says, "Stannis is the rightful heir." He says it without apology. He says, "Joffrey's claim is documented as false." He says, "That is not my doing." He says, "That is the truth of the succession." He says, "I am not the one who made the truth." She says, "What do you want?" He says, "I want your children to be safe." He says, "I want Joffrey to not be king, because Joffrey being king is the worst thing that could happen to the realm and to Joffrey." He says, "I want Tommen to grow up outside the specific pressure of the throne and become the person he is capable of becoming." He says, "I want Myrcella to have the life she deserves." She says, "You want them stripped of everything." He says, "I want them alive and free and away from the specific burden that the Iron Throne represents." He says, "That burden has destroyed every person who has sat in it for the past 30 years. He says, removing them from it is not stripping them. He says, it is releasing them. She looks at him. She says, "You have been watching us for 14 years. He says, "Yes." She says, "Joffrey." He says, "Yes." She says, "And what did you conclude?" He says, "That you love him more than anything in the world." He says, "That your love for him was not enough to protect him from what the specific combination of that love and Robert's absence and the throne's promise produced in him." He says, "That Joffrey is what he is partly because no one in his life showed him what the alternative looks like. He says, I showed him. He says, he was not able to receive it. He says, that is not your fault, and it is not his fault, and it is also a fact. She says, you are 14 years old. He says, I know. She says, you talk about my son like you understand him. He says, I have been watching him for 14 years. He says, I probably understand him better than anyone except you. He says, not because I am clever, because I was present and I paid attention. He says, he was afraid. He says, he found ways to manage the fear that felt like power. He says, he has been living inside that management for so long that the management is him now. She says nothing. He says, your other children are different. He says, Tommen has been different from the beginning. He says, Myrcella has been different. He says, they do not have to pay the price of what Joffrey is. He says, they only pay it if the succession forces them into the fire with him. She is very still. He says, Lord Stannis is just. He says, he is not kind. He says, but he is just. He says, your children live under his justice if the transition is managed correctly. He says, if it is not managed correctly, the outcomes for your children are worse than anything I am describing. She says, you are asking me to yield. He says, I am asking you to protect your children by doing the one thing that actually protects them. He says, which is not fighting a battle you cannot win with weapons that will destroy them in the winning. He says, yielding is not losing. He says, yielding to the truth of the succession is the smartest thing you can do for the children you love. A long silence. Cersei looks at him. She says, your mother. He says nothing. She says, Lyanna Stark. She says it with the flat acknowledgement of someone who has known for 14 years and is finally saying what she knows. She says, she was brave. She says it with the grudging quality of a woman who does not give compliments to rivals and is compelled by accuracy to give this one anyway. She says, whatever she did, and whatever it cost, she was brave. He says, yes, she was. She says, you have her eyes. He says, I know. She says, I have been looking at those eyes in my castle for 14 years. She says, every time I looked at them, I thought about what they meant. She says, about what they could mean if the wrong person looked too closely. He says, you looked closely. She says, yes. He says, and you said nothing. She says, and I said nothing. She says, because moving against you revealed too much. She says, and because, she stops. She says, because you were not what I expected. She says, I expected a threat. He says, you were a 14-year-old boy who checked on the kitchen staff. He says nothing. She says, if I cooperate with this, if I do what you are describing, my children. He says, I give you my word. He says, they are safe. He says, I know what my word is worth. He says, I've been in this castle for 14 years and I have never broken it. He says, ask anyone who knows me. She looks at him for a long time. She says, I will speak to Jaime. He says, thank you. He stands. He goes to the door. He stops. He says, Lady Cersei. He says it with the respect that respect actually requires, not the performed version. He says, you have been in an impossible position for 15 years. He says, married to a man who loved a ghost. He says, managing a court that respected your intelligence without giving it room. He says, raising children in the specific pressure of the succession. He says, none of that was easy and most of it was not fair. He says, I am not unaware of that. She looks at him. She says, you are very strange. He says, yes. He says, I know. He leaves. He has done what he came to do. He goes to find Ned. He has one more thing to do. He goes to Tommen. He finds Tommen in his chambers. Tommen is 9 years old, and he has spent the past 3 days understanding that his father is dead, and his world has changed, and the change is large in ways he cannot fully see yet. He looks at Jon when Jon enters. He says, is it going to be all right? Jon says, yes. He says, different. He says, but all right. Tommen says, Joffrey, Jon says, will be managed. He says it with the truth it deserves, which is that managed is not fixed and not good, and is the best available outcome for a situation that was never going to have a good outcome. He says, he is not going to be king. He says, that is better for him and better for the realm. Tommen says, he's going to be angry. Jon says, yes. He says, he will be very angry. He says, and that anger will have no armies behind it, and no throne underneath it, and he will have to find somewhere to put it that is not on other people. Tommen says, do you think he will? Jon says, I don't know. He says it with the honesty that is the only thing he has to give Tommen, and the only thing Tommen has ever asked for. He says, I hope so. He says, he is afraid, and fear can change direction if the thing it is afraid of changes. He says, without the throne, the specific fear that produced the cruelty may not have the same fuel. Tommen says, is that hope or analysis? Jon says, both. He says, in the best cases, they are the same. Tommen nods. He says, Jon. Jon says, yes. Tommen says, what happens to you now? Jon says, I don't know. He says, there are things about who I am that are going to be known eventually. He says, when they are known, there will be questions about what they mean. He says, I have not answered those questions yet. He says, I will answer them when I have to. Tommen says, are you going to be king? Jon says, no. Tommen says, are you sure? Jon says, I am sure that I do not want to be king. He says, I am not sure the world always gives you what you want on that particular question. He says, but I am working on it. Tommen says, what do you want? Jon says, to be useful. He says it the same way he has always said it, with the specific simplicity of someone whose answer to this question has never changed. He says, to be the thing the realm needs at the moment the realm needs it. He says, and then to go north. He says, there is something coming from beyond the wall that is more important than any of this. He says, I want to be ready for it when it comes. Tommen says, the wall. Jon says, yes. Tommen says, you have always been going north. Jon says, yes. He says, I think I always have. They sit for a moment in the quiet of a boy's chambers while the castle shifts around them and the rain changes and the world reorganizes. Tommen says, will you come back? Jon says, yes. He says it with the certainty of a promise. He says, I will come back when the north is ready and bring back what it needs. He says, that is what I am for. Tommen says, you always know what you are for. Jon says, no. He says, I know where to go to find out. He says, that is different. He says, but it is enough. He stands. He says, get some sleep. He says, tomorrow is the beginning of something new. He says, something better, I think. He says, if we do it right, he goes. He walks through the castle that raised him, past the corridor where Willem the kitchen boy had his arm twisted at 5 years old, past the great hall where he ate at the right table eventually, because Robert gave him a name even if not the right name, past the library where Tyrion taught him how power moves, past the yard where Barristan taught him what the small choices are for. He walks through 14 years of small choices and arrives at the moment they were building toward. He is 14 years old. He is the last Targaryen. He is Robert Baratheon's bastard in name and the castle's strange conscience in practice, and the thing Joffrey was always going to be the opposite of. He is going north eventually. For now he is here. For now there is still work. He goes to find Ned. There is always more work.